I'll be interested in seeing is the role that the EU plays in those elections, I think. Because as we've talked about before, Macron was the only candidate that really ran explicitly pro-EU. So how is that going to play out in the third round elections? And then maybe even in the fourth round, which is what you were talking about before, and the fourth round being the elections in the street.
Right.
Yeah.
The fourth round, the street is always the most complicated issue.
That's very true.
Particularly in French politics.
In French politics, because we saw it in the last 20 years. It's always street demonstration that stop the beginning of reforms that...
in a way, this presidential election has been such a watershed in terms of changing, what we've taken for granted in domestic French politics. And it's going to be really interesting to see whether we still now see a revival of the traditional left-right divide. So the unions, fighting someone who is more centrist, with a somewhat more neoliberal idea about organizing the market. Or if we see something that Marine Le Pen in her speech after the election said, what she tries to do is to really put a lot of emphasis on the opposition between what she calls the patriots, those defending French interest and the fatherland, the nation state, and the globalists, clearly not her favorite, so the Europeanists. And it was remarkable to see that Emmanuel Macron's celebration was with European flags, right, and a real tribute to Europe. And so we might see two different visions that are not defined by the traditional left-right divide, but more one that is a bordered nation state that tries to keep out, the influence that is seen to be not positive for the economy, immigration, in a way going back also to an image of cultural homogeneity that de facto probably has never really existed in modern France. But we've seen this a bit in the United States, this playing with the image of a past that is clearly constructed, but very powerful because it offers simple solutions, right? That's a populist appeal, right? We go back to the cozy times when we were protected from globalization and so forth. And on the other hand, it will be Macron's task to really instill some enthusiasm for the European idea. Referring to Europe as toxic has been toxic over the past 10, 15 years for politicians in Europe. Right now, a new attempt to reintroduce Europe in a positive term. And that's going to be an interesting project for him to carry forward. Right?
Big challenge. It will be a huge challenge to address that, because Europe has been, the victim, in a sense, of all the European politicians. If something is wrong, it's because of Europe. If the economy is too slow, it's because of the policy imposed by Brussels.
And I think part of the issue with Europe, if you think about this from a political perspective as opposed to the actual economic reality perspective, which is politics often is all about words and framing and discourse and optics at some level. And the European Union, in Europe has had a long-term optics problem, in that their successes aren't sold very well by local politicians, their failures are oversold at the local and the domestic level. And so Macron, I think, has to sell the European Union in a different way. Yeah. And one of the things that he could be selling, I think, is the role of is European identity, European citizenship, and that's something that, at some level, I think, has some relevance or salience in some of the other more pro-EU countries, like Germany, for instance. This notion of really belonging to a continent, and that belongingness has some real benefits. I think, ironically, that Brexit might actually help Macron sell the benefits of the EU and sell EU citizenship, because there's the fallout from Brexit and the uncertainty that that's created, and it's actually highlighted the losses that British citizens are going to face because of Brexit, and so it they sort of helped him out with that campaign. So from a political perspective.
But the paradox in Europe, for me, the paradox of the last few years is that the European populations and the European politicians have denounced Europe for the lack of action, the lack of organizations, or the lack of forecasting, especially on the migration issue, on the management of the border. But what have they done? Have they increased the national powers over those issues? The answer is no. The paradox is that when they meet all together, they give Europe more responsibilities, more authorities.
Mm-hmm.
Europe 5 years ago would have never touched the issue of, touching fiscal authorities. It's not in their competences. But when Apple is not paying taxes, the Europeans, they say, what should we do? Let's go to Europe. The commissioner in Europe should do it. And therefore suddenly the European Union has launched actions against some multinational which is responding in a constructive way. Same thing on migration. Migration, we need a Coast Guard. Should we have national Coast Guard or European Coast Guard? Let's go for European Coast Guard. We should have border patrols, and those are Europeans, and so on and so forth. It has been a paradox that I have observed in the last 2 or 3 years in Europe, that Europe has a bad reputation, but at the same time, the solution of the 27 has been to give Europe more responsibilities.
And to add to the paradox, there is, being driven to a policy agenda that is European, if not global, because we can't fix problems like migration, by national governments. On the other hand, politically, it's a hard sell. So there is a real pushback. But that's something that Helga mentioned, right? Maybe Brexit, the realization that you can't really go back to an idealized time of national sovereignty, because some of the issues are simply exceed even the power of the biggest and most powerful state in Europe. So maybe a realization that some of these populist recipes they don't have any policy substance, right? And they're void of addressing those, and that realization might bring some new substance to what Macron represents, right? Trying to also redefine the narrative of Europe. I think that's what you mentioned, right? Europe, I think, is very much open to redefining itself. They've realized, they've been in a difficult position, and there is at the moment an opportunity for the European Union to make some new steps, but also to present itself as a different political agent. Sure enough, they have to follow up with action, but clearly, they need to move away from the past 10, 15 years of a very difficult and challenging position, right, of being branded as, the ones that can't come up with effective policy decisions. And so in a way, the French elections are, the start of something that we might see real shifts in European politics domestically, new actors coming in. We mentioned, the civil society re-engagement, and great degree of anger across the continent, response still to the economic crisis, high unemployment, butมันalso might trigger something new at the European level, with the European Union finding a new position and a new message to send to the citizens. Thank you very much. It's great, having you, and I'm sure Europe won't disappoint us in new news and new challenging things to talk about. Thank you very much.